Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We just have some breaking news. Alex Karp, CEO of Palantir, released a new letter to all shareholders, investors, and basically the entire world called In Defense of Europe. Now, this is his official response to what's happening and the tragedy of what's happening in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why is this relevant right now? Palantir's technology is hypothetically, and it is being theorized that it is used in overtime to help the US government, help European governments, help what other governments it works with in order to assess and deal with the decision with the problem of Russia and Ukraine and make real-time decisions based upon AI, machine learning, all the stuff that they're able to offer to governments based on scenarios that are happening right now. Gotham was created as a product to deal with these situations. We just had Sham go on a Morgan Stanley conference, and I did a video covering it yesterday, where he explicitly mentioned, hey, we created this product many years ago in preparation for land war with Russia. And now that situation is happening, now that that chaotic scenario that Alex Karp was talking about in December when he did his interview with Kevin Warsh from Stanford University is happening because the world is insane and what happens in the world is crazy. The question is Palantir's product and software not only going to be able to live up to the moment and help the clients that need to help it, but is this going to serve as a precedent for the product to actually be able to expand and grow as a result of the instability that we are seeing from a geopolitical perspective? The theorization from shareholders that are very interested in the company like myself, is that yes, the reason why Alex Karp was at the Munich Data and Security Conference in Germany, and the reason why Germany just upped its defense spending by $100 billion, the reason why the US federal government just passed a $700 billion defense spending plan, is that the governments around the world are starting to recognize that things are not as peachy and rosy as we think they are. The COVID pandemic was one thing that showed a lot of people that things can get really bad. And then Russia-Ukraine is another thing that says things can really get really bad. In 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and ultimately took it over. After 8 years, there was relatively peace within the region, and now things are bad. Because we cannot predict that peace, because we don't know if it's ever going to stay, products like Gotham are essential. And this was one of the responses, a formal response that a lot of shareholders were expecting, because Palantir's product, if it is being used in this scenario and it is something that is going to be able to help people in this scenario, is there going to be an official response from Palantir and Alex Karp? We do have a response. I'm going to be reading this letter and analyzing it. This letter is very poetic and philosophical in some ways. So let's get through the letter and let's talk about it. March 10th, 2022. The facts of history have always been inconvenient for those whose convictions about its purported arc are strongest. It is now clear that the fantasy of an enduring and perpetual peace in Europe was premature at best. A desire for coherence in the beliefs one holds is often so strong and important, and dissonant features of the world are dismissed in favor of a pre-existing conception of the way things ought to be. But the conflation by those in power of is and ought, the blending of the descriptive and normative accounts of the world, is and ought is there's an actual is-ought fallacy. So he's talking about a philosophical, like Logic 101 argument right there about things that are descriptive, things that you're describing about the world, and things that are normative, things that already exist, persists at the center of the current crisis. The mere belief, however fervent, that nations should settle their disagreements through discourse does little to constrain a country's use of violence to advance its political aims. Here he's saying, look, democracy is good, democracy works. But the idea that democracy is going to be the only thing that lasts in a world where, people have nuclear weapons is probably a bit silly. The war in Eastern Europe, so he's talking specifically about what's going on right now in Russia-Ukraine, stems from a collective suspension of disbelief by those whose overconfidence in recent decades in the raw power of their ideals enabled the balance of power in Europe to shift. Basically saying, hey, we thought everything was going to be okay. It's not. We have collectively been so certain for so long that history has ended, that the world's most significant moral questions have essentially been resolved, that we continue to confront the unraveling of history with some degree of quite shock. He's saying, look, we think everything's good. We think we solved everything with World War II and getting rid of Nazi Germany, but things are not as good as they seem. A lack of genuine interest in shifts in national ambitions and capabilities can be fatal to those who would rather impose their view of the appropriate arc of history onto history's disjointed path than investigate its complexity. These views of history about its rhythms and seeming contradictions have informed the ways our company has organized itself for the purpose of constructing software and the specific software products that we have chosen to build. This is why you invest in Palantir. You believe that their software is going to have a competitive advantage because the nature of how it is created from a philosophical perspective and from a technological perspective is built for bad times and built for a chaotic world. COVID was one example, and the war in Eastern Europe is another example. When we founded our company, it was broadly assumed that the only way to effectively combat terrorism was to build software platforms that would assist the state in gathering every shred of information and evidence about its citizens without any concern for their rights. We rejected this assumption from the start. So Palantir here is explicitly admitting, look, when we started after 9/11, people thought that, oh, the only way you can stop counterterrorism is if you just invade people's civil liberties and get all their data. They rejected that assumption and they built their technology without that premise. And that makes a lot of sense because Peter Thiel, which is the ultra libertarian of the world, is, co-founded the company. He would have never created a company that would do that. Our business has grown over the years precisely because we refused to build what the market thought it wanted and make the real misguided fantasy of an omniscient state. The access controls, security and privacy protections, and constraints on use that we build into our software platforms, that is, the limitations of the power of such software as well as its fortifications against misuse, are what preserve our collective freedom. The ability for them to protect civil liberties is what creates freedom. But Europe and its allies must not forget that the relationship between the vulgar power of the state, its credible threat of effective violence to extend the operation of politics by other means, and the ability of that state to advance its views on individual liberty or the appropriate limitations of state surveillance, for example, are inextricably linked. The privilege to engage in defending the individual against state power is made possible by state power itself. That is something I want to analyze real quick. The privilege to engage in defending the individual against state power, meaning like stop the state from intruding you, is made possible by state power itself. What does that mean? Second Amendment in the United States. For those who are watching who are not from the United States, the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. It is the reason it's the First Amendment is freedom of speech, right? So it's like, all right, you can say whatever you want. No one's going to hurt you within reason, right? Second Amendment is you can bear arms, meaning you can have a right to own a gun. And if the state becomes too tyrannical, it's the nature of having an armed militia, you can attack the state. Well, the only reason we're able to attack the state is because the state has given us that freedom. This is the philosophical nature of what Karp is talking about. You don't get to go against, like, people in Russia can't just go up against the state, because the state has nukes and tanks. Now, the state in the United States also has nukes and tanks, but there is a philosophical premise that, okay, you have the ability to defend yourself because the founding fathers of the country realized that if the people don't have the ability to defend themselves against a tyrannical state, and we don't create that foundational element of freedoms within the documents of the state itself, right, the Bill of Rights, Constitution, etc., if we don't guarantee that freedom, then the individual is always going to be at the mercy of the tyranny of the state. So the idea that Karp is talking about here is that the privilege to engage in defending the individual against state power, which is the whole nature of their software, right? Civil liberties protected in order to protect the state, is rooted in the state recognizing the necessity of why civil liberties need to be protected in the first place. And if the state can recognize why we need to protect civil liberties, that can also reconcile in the state understanding that protecting civil liberties is key to protecting collective freedoms. That is extremely important when we're talking about tyrannical states and governments needing software and technology to be able to go against those tyrannical states like Palantir software, when being able to deal with the craziness of those states. So the final thing here is that the reason you're actually implying that Palantir software is good is because the software is built from an understanding that if we can protect the individual, we can protect the collective, just like the United States says, hey, the individual has a right to bear arms because if the individual is protected, then the entire state and the collective is protected as well. The absurdity of discussing the appropriate limitations on state or corporate power in the digital age without having a means to defend oneself often seems most apparent to outsiders or those who have been persecuted consistently over time. The need for raw forms of power, technological or otherwise, is often lost on those who have enjoyed it for too long. The successful construction and defense of a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, das Monopol legitimale Fischer blah. That was my version of Germany, is not only what defines the state, as Max Weber made clear, but what makes the state's continued survival possible. Soft power and cultural influence that many in Europe and the United States had hoped would someday make militaries obsolete has failed spectacularly to stem the aspirations of an autocratic rule. So he's basically saying, look, like you thought we were going to get rid of militaries because everything was okay. That didn't happen. The fantasy of an instinctively peaceful world may be comforting, but it's again coming to an end. Europe has for the past 2 decades stood on the sidelines of the digital revolution, whose principal participants are still essentially all based in the United States. The unrelenting innovation and disruption from American firms has reshaped industries and extinguished others. But the founding spark for Silicon Valley was its embrace of the defense objectives and technological aims of the government, whose very existence made its rise possible. The intersection of technical engineering talent, the protection and relative insulation of academia, and the government's aggressive search for truly disruptive technology to advance its defense and intelligence objectives gave rise to the Silicon Valley that we know today. It's the reason why Palantir was funded and subsidized by the government. Our expansion as a company over the years was made possible by our work with the government agencies in the military and intelligence sectors in the United States, whose leaders took an interest in software and understood its potential to reshape national defense. Software, as much as anything everything else is a product of the legal and moral order from which it stems and plays a role in defending it. The need for Europe to become a leader in disruptive defense technology is clear. The continent certainly understands that its defense and that of its allies now requires the development of an indigenous source of strength and the capacity to defend itself, and quickly. But for Europe to do this will require more than additional funding and a momentary pause in the familiar and ordinary political disputes of a continent still very much in the process of negotiating the terms of a shared identity in the future. An embrace of the relationship between technology and the state, between disruptive companies that seek to dislodge the grip of entrenched contractors and the federal government ministries with funding, will be required for Europe and its allies to remain strong enough to defeat the threat of foreign occupation. He's basically saying European governments, United States governments that have all these stupid contractors that they're paying all this money to for legacy technology that doesn't work, that doesn't get the job done, you're going to have to embrace something new if you want to stop foreign entities from invading you and doing bad things to you. Our software is in the fight around the world, the center will hold, but we need an allied technology industry in Europe to step up and fight this battle alongside us in order to win. Alex Karp, Chief Executive Officer and Co-founder, Palantir Technologies. Now, this letter is a sales pitch. Let's not get confused. This letter is a sales pitch. It is just a really good sales pitch. It is a sales pitch that basically says, look, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, it's bad. We can help you guys. We can save you guys. We can really make sure that things get good. In order for that to happen, we need to develop a relationship. And in order for you to understand why we're so good, you should try out our technology and you should recognize that our technology is built. That's why it's kind of poetic, right? Because he starts the framing of the letter from the very beginning, talking about this nature of why Palantir was created, civil liberties, the protection of the state, the dichotomy and simultaneous symbiotic relationship that exists between the individual and the state. All of that stuff is incredibly important and relevant when we're trying to understand what Palantir is trying to do here. And this letter is an effective sales pitch, I believe, to the entire European market that says, hey, you guys are going to ramp up defense spending. You're going to get a lot of bids from a lot of contractors. We're the guys that can actually do this. We're the ones that have built this from the beginning. We're the ones that have built with GDPR regulations, privacy, data, all that stuff intact. We're the ones that when terrorism was being combated, we're the guys that said, no, we should not use and invade other people and their data in order to combat terrorism. So because we're the guys, you should let us be the guys for you as well. I thought it was a good letter. I think Alex Karp is not just a CEO. I think he's a poet. I think his sales pitch is rooted in philosophy. And ultimately, I'm happy that they finally came out and gave a letter of a formal decree of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, because all of us definitely believe that Palantir can play a big role in actually stopping and hopefully stopping future things that happen with Russia and Ukraine. So those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.